Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Lunchtime Learning DC Zoning 101 Plus. Today's program is sponsored by Sullivan & Barrows and presented by Martin Sullivan. If you have questions during the presentation, please enter them using the Q&A button. Martin will be answering all questions at the end of the program. Before we get started, a quick legal disclaimer. By participating in this webinar, you're granting your permission to be recorded and for the recording to be distributed by AIADC and the Washington Architectural Foundation. And now it's AIADC's pleasure to introduce to you from Sullivan & Barrows, Martin Sullivan. Martin?
Thank you, Laura. Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining. I think I'm going to go to the objectives first, the learning objectives for today. What I'd like to do is provide some key information for zoning. I know most of you know a lot of this, and so in that case, it could be a good review. Also, I hope to impart a few things maybe that you don't know that might be helpful for you. But one of my objectives is to provide a structure of sorts and a organizational bird's eye view of the zoning regulations, which may be helpful for you. And so the first thing I'll talk about is some key reference information that I use for my zoning information. And then I'm going to go over some of the basics, most of which you know already. But again, I would hope to organize it for you. What I call 101 plus, I would go over some of the advanced zoning information that's helpful to know. These items are things that come up for my clients, architects that I work with, things that are often missed or almost missed and can present a problem, and things that you should have on a checklist somewhere so you don't miss them. And then I'm going to talk about the BZA a little bit. I know a lot of you have dealt with the BZA, some not. I would like to just give you an overview of how that process works, so you know that it's available to you in certain cases, but also what cases to avoid taking to the BZA, so that you can better advise your clients when they ask you those questions. Also, the last objective is I would like to talk a little bit about you as an architect or the AIA as an organization participating in the zoning regulation amendment process. And I want to just say that the purpose of this presentation is not to provide legal advice, this is my disclaimer, but to promote a broad understanding of the regs. And this information is intended to be a starting point for you for further analysis, and I hope you'll find that helpful. A little bit about myself. I've been practicing in DC as a zoning attorney since 1998 with a 2-year hiatus to work for a home builder in Rockville about 12 years ago. And what we do is we do zoning due diligence and consults for developers or architects. And we do, of course, BZA and zoning commission cases. And we also do a lot of work with DCRA, permitting zoning issues, dealing with Matt LeGrand's staff and comments that they make on permit applications. And we work projects of all sizes, from single family additions, decks, to commercial, multifamily, hotel, institutional, and light industrial. So I want to go over the key zoning sources that we used. And this is the order in which I use them most. You'll notice that the DC zoning map is 4th on this list. I rarely use it because I can usually get the information I need from these other sources. And I find the zoning map a little glitchy, actually. So the first source is Property Quest. This is my particular go-to site. When a client calls, the first question is always, what's the address? And this screen is always open. And I find key information here. You'll see the lot and square number. It tells whether or not it's a record lot, which is important, and I'll talk about that a little more later. There's also a link here, this MU4. link. And I'm actually going to go into this website here. And I want to type in the address that you saw on that page. And I want to point out some of the things that I use. First of all, I use this just to get a general view of where the property is. This website works really well in contrast to the zoning website, the zoning map website. Land area is something I'm always looking for. And the zone, of course. Now you can click through on this zone, MU4, and you'll get to the zoning handbook. I would not rely on the handbook. I've seen it inaccurate on enough occasions to know that it should not be relied on. But maybe it's helpful in some sense, but verify that information if you're principally getting your information from the handbook. The next source that we use is the GIS Atlas Plus map, and this is the same property here. And you'll see, this is 3700 14th Street. You'll see the blue line here, that's a building restriction line, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And the other thing you'll see here is this green colored area. This is a tax lot, 859 and 860. Those are probably the two most important things I look for when I use this map. I also use this map for measurement purposes, and I'll show you how that works. Pulling up the same property. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with what a BRL is, a building restriction line. Essentially, it takes property that's part of the property and turns it into public space effectively. You can't build on it. You can do on it what you could normally do on public space. So you could have bays and porches and some other information or other items with approval from Public Space Committee. Also very important, you can't park on this side of a BRL as well. So I go to layers, click on property and land, and then select building restriction line. And you'll see the line comes up, and you can see the impact that it has on this property. You can't park on the property as a result of this. The other thing that's critical, and it doesn't relate to this property, but one thing I'll talk about later is when a property comes up on Property Quest, the first site I looked at, and by the way, Property Quest, or the information on Property Quest, is what DCRA sees. Shows tax lots. If there's a tax lot and a record lot in the same space, DCRA will call it a tax lot, and they'll ignore the fact that it's a record lot. And this is where I go to find out whether or not something has an underlying record lot or a corresponding record lot. Tax lots are almost always in the 800 number, record lots from 1 to 300 usually. So this is an example of two lots that are both record lots and tax lots. And I'll explain why that's important in a later part of the presentation. But whenever I see a tax lot on Property Quest, the next step is to go to the GIS and hold on, and find out whether or not there's also a record lot there. Now the zoning map. So what I use the zoning map for, really the only thing I use it for, is to find out whether or not this particular property has a BZA or zoning commission history, or whether there is such history on the surrounding block. And I'm going to see if I can pull this up, or we'll see if it's glitchy today. Okay, good, it's working. So on the left, scroll down, and it says cases for this lot. No zoning commission cases. There is a BZA case for this lot. And you can click right through and get to the BZA case file at the Office of Zoning website, where you can find an order, you can find transcripts, and you can find the entire case log. This one happened to be a parking variance, which is was something that was required prior to 2016 and then no longer required after that. So it was never put into effect. So you can also see on this, I'm on the PowerPoint now rather, but below there, it also gives you cases in the square. So you can find precedents possibly when you're looking at a case and whether or not you want to go to the BZA. History Quest, I principally use this to find out what year a building was built. And there's two reasons I can think of right now why I do that. First of all, in the RF zone, we do a lot of 3-unit conversions, which is a BZA case, and that requires that you are working with a building that was built prior to 1958. And History Quest tells you what year the building was built. There's a lot more information you all might find more helpful than I do. The other thing I look at this for is to find out whether or not a building falls into the period of significance for a historic district. So you'll see here that the White House was built in 1800. And that's the kind of information you can find on most lots in the city when you use History Quest. So moving on to the zoning regulations. I want to talk about how the zoning regulations are organized. Let me go to this page first. So this is my, this page is up always on my screen. This is actually my starter screen when I open my internet. And this is actually not the official regulations. The official regulations are in the Office of Documents. It's another website. I have found that these regulations are usually more accurate than the official regulations. And these are definitely a lot easier to work with. So how these are organized. The regulations are organized. First of all, there's subtitles. They're broken out into subtitles. And subtitle A through C has general information. D through K is the development standards. These are the area elements. These are the setbacks, the height, the lot occupancy. Subtitle U, conveniently named, is for use permissions. This tells you what you can do in a particular zone. And then some other subtitles handle PUDs or BZA procedures and zoning commission procedures. Now, organization of the zones that you'll be dealing with in the district. And I don't have all the zones in here. This is representative, but these are, the zones I list here are probably 95% of what I work on. So the residential zones can be broken down into 3 categories. There's single family dwellings, there's 2-family dwellings, and then there's multifamily, which is 3+. And the single family dwelling zone can then be broken out into 3 different zones. R1 is for fully detached single family dwellings. R2 is for semi-detached, and semi-detached, by the way, is defined as a building with 1 side yard. So you have 1 side of the building on a lot line and 1 with a side yard. It does not have to be touching a building. So it could be fully detached, but the fact that it's on 1 property line, it's considered to be attached on that side. And then R3 is a row, which is a building with no side yards. So you're touching 2 lot lines. For a couple years after they changed the 2016 regs, there was a lot of confusion with semi-detached and row. And they defined a row house only as something that was touching buildings on both sides, rather than something that was just touching lot lines. But they did correct that. So then R6 through R21 are just simply versions of R1, 2, and 3 with what used to be called overlays. Something I don't think that I put in the PowerPoint, but you'll find very helpful. And let me find the link for this. Well, I'll get to it at some point in the presentation, but at the Office of Zoning website, you can get to a screen that still has the conversion from the old regs prior to 2016 till now. It's only been 5 years, but that's helpful when you're looking at other R zones. You can see, for instance, that R15 is Wesley Heights overlay. And maybe you're familiar with what the Wesley Heights overlay was. And I find that helpful. I use that conversion table a lot. So flats is just 2 family dwellings. You're permitted up to 2 units. Apartments is 3+. Those zones are RA1 and RA2. There's several other RA zones. I don't think that I've seen something other than RA1 and 2 in several years. So the other zones are a lot more rare than RA1 and RA2. And I'll go into RA1 a lot more later on in the presentation, because there's a lot going on in the RA1 zone district at the moment. And then there's the mixed use zones, MU, which is mixed use, NC, which is essentially mixed use, but with the neighborhood commercial overlay. And then industrial. There are some other zones. I left out the downtown district, which that could be several presentations just on its own, and I didn't want to get into that. Waterfront zone, there's still an SP zone out there as well. So my sources for the zoning regulations, I talked about this a little bit. It's the Office of Zoning Regs here. The great thing about these is it's, as opposed to the official regs, when you open up a subtitle, you get the whole subtitle. When you go to the official regs and you open up a subtitle, you just get a section. And you have to know which section you're looking for before you can search. So now I can search, use a search term for this whole section. These are the quote unquote official regs. And you'll see what I mean when I go into sections. First of all, it's slow. So I'm going to look for parking information. And so I'll go to subtitle C, chapter 7. And then I have to know what parking information I'm looking for. So I think you get the picture. as opposed to these where I can just open subtitle C. And I have it all, and actually I could click through this section. So when I see what are the parking requirements under 701, I can click on that and it takes me there. Oh, one other thing about these that's helpful. At the bottom is a PDF of the entire regs. So you can do a word search, and the word search is pretty good. It's pretty reliable of all the regs here. When there's a question about whether or not you have accurate language, because I've had situations where the official regs don't match what I call the OZ regs. The bottom line is the DC register. So the DC register has the initial publication of the regulations and any amendments to the regulations. So this is kind of advanced and you may not need it, but the way you find it, if you have some confusion about a regulation, you can find at the end of a section, look in subtitle C. You'll see at the end of the section, there'll be references to the source. And this is pointing you to the DC register. So if there's some question about language up here, you can go to and find when this was published, and you can actually go to the DC register and print that out. I've had to do that actually several times but it's not often. I mean, you can pretty much rely on these regulations. So my typical progression when I'm looking at a property, I don't know if you share this process or not. First question is the use permitted. So I go to subtitle U, and then what can I build or what can I add? Or can the client build and add? And then I go to subtitle D through K. And then when I need additional information, for instance, I know what the rear yard requirement is, but it's not a typical property. And it's shaped differently, and we're not sure what the rear yard requirement is. We go to the rules of measurement and the definitions in subtitle B. And then subtitle C has some other requirements like parking, but it also has more detailed information on some of the items like inclusionary zoning, and it has the rules for penthouses, as I'm sure most of you know that already. I use a checklist. We at Sullivan Barrows, we use a checklist, and it's a tickler. We don't have all the information in it. Feel free to use this, but I would say it may not be inclusive of everything, and we add to it often because interpretations change, requirements change, and it's you'll see at the top there, I have different columns for residential and mixed use. And this is something that we use and look at so that we hopefully don't miss anything important. And I'll go over some of those things that do stick out. So I'm going to go over specific overviews of the zones. A lot of this I'm sure you know, but so the R1 zone overview, it's 40% lot occupancy, 40 feet in height, 8-foot side yards, 25-foot rear yard. There's a front yard setback. It's within the range of setbacks on the block. The thing you need to know about that is it does not include a covered porch. So what sets that range of setbacks is the front of the building itself. not the front of a covered porch. This comes up sometimes as an issue. If you look on Property Quest and you happen to see footprints, you can't tell whether it's a covered porch or not. And you may think that your setback range is different than what it actually is. Now, you can add a covered porch beyond the setback requirement as well, but you can't put your building within using that as your range point. Pervious surface, 50%. When you're doing an addition to building, if you're not increasing the building more than 10% lot occupancy, you don't have to worry about pervious surface. Parking always requires one parking space for a single family home unless you don't have alley access. If you don't have alley access, you have no parking requirement. And that only applies in it only applies for single families and flats. R2. R2 is the semi-detached zone. And the general requirements, still 40% lot occupancy, 40 feet in height, 3 stories, at least one 8-foot side yard. This is in contrast to the R3 zone, where if you have a side yard, it can be 5 feet. So there's still an 8-foot side yard requirement in the R2, 20-foot rear yard, and there's still a front yard setback. One thing about the front yard setback that comes into play when you have attached houses, either semi-detached or fully attached row dwellings, there's 2 setback requirements for the front yard. You have to be within the range on the block of all the frontages. But there's a separate requirement that you not be further forward or further back than any adjoining building. So if you're touching another building on either side, you basically have to match that frontage. And if you have 2, you just have to match one of those. And you can't even be in between them. So if you have one that's 10 feet forward and one's 5 feet back, you have to match one or the other. R3 zone. R3 is the row dwelling zone. Still single family. Can't do 2 units here yet. You can do accessory dwelling units here, but they're somewhat restricted. Minimum lot area is 2,000 square feet. Lot width is 20 feet. So you can get to 60% lot occupancy here, but in this zone, I'm sorry, 60% lot occupancy just for row dwellings though. In this zone, you're 40% lot occupancy if you're semi-detached. And if you have a semi-detached building, you can't turn it into a row building without tearing it down. And that came about over the years. Actually, it was a BZA appeal about 10, 15 years ago, specifically as a result of an owner attempting to turn his building from semi-detached into row in order to get the increased lot occupancy. So, and that was the trigger for what we have now, where you cannot remove an existing side yard in the residential zones in the RF zone, in the R and RF zones. If you have a side yard, 5 feet, 20-foot rear yard, still front yard setback. RF zone, my favorite zone. Row dwellings, no more than 2 dwelling units. So you can have 2 principal dwelling units in the RF zone. You can't have an accessory dwelling unit. Accessory dwelling units only take place in the R1, 2, and 3 zones, and all the other overlay R zones, but not in the RF zone. That's because you can do 2 principal dwelling units. If you could do an accessory, you'd effectively end up with 3 units. And so that's not permitted in the RF zone. So there's a minimum lot area of 1,800 square feet and a lot width of 18 feet. One second. Lot occupancy 60%, 35 feet in height, 3 stories. This is in contrast to the other zones, which still had a 40-foot height requirement. You can get a special exception to go to 40 feet in height, and that's typically approved. 20-foot rear yard, front yard setback, same parking requirement, 1 for every 2 units. Some of the things I want to talk about in the RF zone. We do a lot of 3-unit conversion cases. Prior to 2016, you could convert an existing single family or flat that was built prior to 1958. You could convert to multiple units, provided you had 900 square feet of lot area for every unit. And so if you had a 2,700 square foot lot, you could go to 3 units as a matter of right. 3,600, you could go to 4 units. So we did as many as 7 units. There was a case, I don't know if it ever got built, but there was a zoning determination letter for a project that was going to go from a single family to something like 40 units because of the land area that they had. So they put a stop to that in 2016. Actually, it was 2015, a year before the new regulations came on board. And they made all conversions to more than 2 units BZA special exception. And when they adopted that, they also adopted, or shortly after, adopted the 10-foot rule for those cases, and what we know as the restrictions or the prohibitions on altering architectural elements, and threw in solar panels a couple years later. So we'll talk about this more in the BZA section of the presentation, but 3-unit conversions commonly approved, and usually the 3 units is not a issue for the BZA. Any issues the BZA has revolve around the size of any addition that's being undertaken as part of that case. 10-foot rule applies not only to 3-unit conversions, but to any addition that you do to an adjoining building in the R1 zone up to the RF zone. Doesn't apply to RA or MU, it just applies up to the RF zone. And you have to be touching the building. We're very close. The zoning administrator has determined if you're less than a foot away, that it's effectively adjoining. And so you might be subject to a 10-foot rule in that case, even if the buildings aren't connected. Architectural elements. In the RF zone, there is a restriction on altering an architectural element on any facade of the building other than the rear facade, essentially. And what an architectural element is a mansard, a dormer, a turret, tower, even a porch roof or cornice. So when they did this, they effectively created, in my opinion, a de facto historic district all across RF zone, other than the fact that you could still raise a building without regard to the architectural elements. But if you're keeping the building, you're subject to that prohibition. RA1. So RA1 is a multifamily zone. It's a low density zone. There's only a 0.9 FAR density. That's actually the lowest density in the city. It's a lower density than you would have in the R1A zone, the single family detached zone, where there is no FAR requirement, but at 40% lot occupancy and 3 stories, you effectively get to 1.2. 40% lot occupancy, 40 feet in height, 3 stories. side yard requirement. And this is the first zone where you have a GAR requirement. RA1 is the only zone where all new residential development requires BZA approval. And the question about what is and is not new residential development has been changing quickly the last few years. From 1970 or so until about 3 or 4 years ago, the definition of what was new residential development kind of tracked the same definition it would be for any other zone, which in the last 7 or 8 years has sort of crystallized around this idea that if you're keeping 40% of the exterior walls of your building, then you're not new residential development and you're doing an addition. And if you get below that 40%, it's what's known as a zoning raise. You don't have to get a raise permit for it, but the zoning administrator treats it as if it's a new building. And that has impacts on several different areas of the zoning regs, including parking regulations and use, and also has impacts for some aspects of the building which might be non-conforming. You're effectively working with a new building. So in 2016, the zoning commission changed the parking requirement. It used to be 1-to-1 in the RA1 zone, and then it went to 1 for every 3 after the first 4. There's a lot of RA1 properties that are smaller properties mixed in with single family zone. So effectively, your parking requirement for an 8-unit went from 8 parking spaces to 1 parking space in 2016. And this obviously led to a lot more interest in developing in the RA1 zone. And so the zoning administrator took it upon himself to issue guidance. I would call it new regulations that weren't duly adopted, but he expanded the definition of what new was. Actually, he didn't expand the definition. I misspoke there. He shrunk the definition of what new was. Or no, I'm sorry, he expanded it. He expanded the definition of new and said, if you're doubling the number of units in gross floor area or adding 10 units, you're new, regardless of what you do to the building. So you could have an 80-unit building and add 10 units, your new residential development. Then in an appeal last summer, the BZA said that they didn't like LeGrand's determination, but they didn't say what the new determination should be. They just said, we don't like your rule. And they granted that appeal. And in response to that, the zoning administrator determined that adding any units to an existing RA1 building or adding any gross floor area makes it new. So consequences of that, we probably did 1 RA1 BZA case every year or 2 prior to 2016. And I think we've already done 6 or 7 this year as a result. So it's become much more available to developers to develop, and at the same time, they've made it harder to avoid the BZA. The zoning commission is, I think, about to make some changes to the RA1. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. Don't know which way it'll go, but I can't imagine that it's going to get easier. And a heads up regarding penthouse habitable space. In my opinion, the zoning regulations were pretty clear that penthouse hab space is not permitted in the RA1 zone, but it's been getting approved. Penthouse hab space has been getting approved the last 2 or 3 years at all levels. It's been getting approved by the BZA, by Office of Planning in our BZA cases, and then by the zoning administrator, and it's been getting built. I think the party's over. Just found out yesterday that the Office of Planning and the OAG counsel for the BZA and the zoning administrator have finally discovered that they've been wrongly approving this. So there's going to be some changes. And I'm not exactly sure when this is going to become official. If you have a building permit already for that, you're okay. RA2, you don't need BZA for this. 1.8 FAR, 50 feet in height, 60% lot occupancy. MU zones, MU4, principally, we do most of our work in here, don't do a whole lot of work in the other zones. Here's some of the basic criteria for those zones. NC zones are mostly these three zones with overlays. George Avenue overlay, H Street overlay make up a large portion of those NC zones. As mentioned, there are some other zones which I didn't cover in this. 101 plus. So I'm going to go over a couple of the items that come up for me a lot. I mentioned record lots and tax lots. The reason a record lot is important is because in order to do new construction or an addition, you must have a record lot. And so you need that record lot plat. If you don't have a record lot plat from the surveyor's office, the zoning reviewer is going to tell you to get a subdivision. If you don't meet the minimum lot area or width requirements, you technically are not able to get that subdivision, although it gets approved often. So you really need to be careful about whether or not you have a record lot when you're looking at doing an addition or new construction. And that's where you would go to the Atlas Plus GIS to make sure to see if there's an underlying record lot. It's a little convoluted how they let you do it, but if you have an underlying record lot under that tax lot and they are in the same boundaries, you will be able to build on that record lot / tax lot. Some of the things that come up very rarely and catch us by surprise, there's a 30-foot lot frontage requirement when you do a new record lot for multifamily. And you have to be careful with this. If you come up against it, you want to get your subdivision and get your new record lot before you apply for a building permit for the multifamily. And it'll go through. Because once you establish the record lot, you don't have to worry about this requirement. Measuring stories in the R and RF zone. This is really critical because a couple years ago, you could manipulate the grade or you could manipulate the floors in your building. There's a 3-story limit. Where this comes up most often, of course, is in the RF zone. And a developer looks at a property, wants to add a 3rd story. And you could look at a property, and I think I might have one here. So here's a property. This is 1808 Ontario Place, where we did an appeal. And the zoning administrator determined that this was 3 stories. 1, 2, 3 stories. And so the developer did an addition up here on the 3rd story. Some people in the community thought that this lower level was the 1st story, making this 4 stories, making an addition up top impossible. And the measurement that you need to do for this is you measure at the finished 1st floor and the horizontal line out, extended out from the finished 1st floor to the grade at the center of the front of the building. And that has to be less than 5 feet. If it's less than 5 feet, this is not a story. And you can build what would be a 3rd story at that point. This gets really complicated when you have an areaway under a porch like this. And that's what the ANC was claiming, that we should have measured at the bottom of this areaway. And that would be our height measurement, which would mean our building was taller than 40 feet and it was 4 stories. That was an appeal that went to the BZA. Luckily, we won that appeal. But you need to be very careful about whether this lower level is a story, because there's no way out of it anymore, unfortunately. Measuring FAR, the one thing you need to remember, as opposed to measuring the number of stories, when you're measuring FAR, you measure at the front and the back of the building, not just the front, and that can make a huge difference. And that measurement, which is also the 5-foot measurement, by the way, you measure from the front and the back, you determine what percentage, essentially, of that lower level is less than 5 feet, what percentage is greater than 5 feet. And then you apply that percentage to the entire area of that lower level. And part of that FAR, you may have FAR in your lower level that you didn't think you had. And that would impact possibly plans to do an addition up if you're out of FAR. This comes up in the RA zone mostly, MU a little bit, but mostly in RA too. 10-foot rule. That's, you can't build your building, the rear line of your building, more than 10 feet beyond the rear line of either adjoining building. So it applies to both sides. You have to comply with the 10-foot rule on each side. Wet bar covenants. I know a lot of you have come up against this. If you're putting a wet bar in a basement, the zoning administrator is requiring a covenant because there's apparently a prohibition, another unwritten rule, prohibition on having a second kitchen in a building, in a house, in a single family house. I find the wet bar covenants pretty harmless. They're a little bit of an administrative hassle, but they don't really obligate you to do anything that you're not already obligated to do. I'm going to move along because I want to get to, one other thing, zoning administrator guidance. You can find zoning determination letters from the zoning administrator, and these are searchable. The search engine's not perfect, but you might find some helpful information in there in these letters. I want to talk about BZA quickly. Basics of BZA. We go to BZA for special exception and variance relief. Special exception relief is relief that's provided for specifically in the regs. You can get relief from the 10-foot rule, provided you meet these requirements. Variance relief is there's nothing in the regs for it. You just want to not have that provision apply to you. The main thing you need to know about this is variance relief is getting tougher and tougher. You need to be careful and think twice before going for variance relief. We just got a couple approved this week, but they were the kind of variances that typically get approved. Most of them, it's just getting, the review's getting a little bit tough. By the same token, special exception relief, still not that difficult in most cases. It seems they want to funnel everything into special exception and to dissuade people from asking for variance relief. Timing, from application date to hearing date, it's about 6 months now. Here's filing fees. We have virtual hearings currently. Hopefully that continues. And you'll have this information here. I'm going to move along, make sure we finish in time to have some questions. These are likely cases. 3-unit conversions get approved. I hope the board's not listening all the time. It's just that sometimes the additions could get scaled back, or it could get denied if the addition's way too big. 10-foot rule relief, not difficult if you're asking for 15 feet or less. A lot depends on how the neighbors feel about it. Things to avoid use variances and avoid, unfortunately, most area variances. Going beyond 70% lot occupancy in the RF zone, MU zone, not MU, RF zone, RA zone. requires an area variance, and they're getting very difficult. We also do appeals at the BZA. And this is when, if you don't like a zoning administrator decision, you can file an appeal. Or if a neighbor doesn't like a zoning administrator decision, they can file an appeal. And this is how we ended up where we are with the RA1, because a neighbor filed an appeal of an RA1 permit issuance, and then we had to go for special exception because the BZA effectively changed the definition of what was new. The reason I put these other items here, are these are things I would like to see somebody appeal. This prohibition on second kitchens, which is written nowhere, or the 3-foot setback. I'm sure a lot of you are aware with this one. You have to be set back 3 feet from a mansard roof when you're doing an addition, even though that's not written anywhere in the regulations. It'd be nice if somebody filed an appeal on that. I want to talk really briefly about text amendments, because this is an area where I think that the AIA and architects should have more input. So please go to these slides, search these text amendments. When the Zoning Commission is adopting changes to the zoning regulations, they have an open hearing process. You can participate in that. And I think that the Zoning Commission would tend to listen to an authority like the AIA a lot more than they would to developers when they show up with concerns about some of the changes. Go back to the architectural elements that were adopted 4 or 5 years ago. That to me has sort of taken design flexibility away from the private architect and put it in the hands of the government in a sense. And I don't know that the architectural community saw that coming, but it'd be good to be aware if something like that comes forward in the future, or if there's ever a chance to talk about that again with the Zoning Commission. So, and I intend to talk to the AIA a little more, see if we can get a little more involved in commenting as an organization on these text amendments when they come up. And that's it. So time for questions now.
Thank you, Martin. We do have a few questions here. If anyone else has a question, please type it in the Q&A box now. Our first question is, how would one look up a property in Property Quest, etc., if there's no address yet?
Yeah, good question. Because if there's no building there, they won't let you pull it up by the address, or it usually doesn't have an address. Square and lot. So you just put in the square and then a space and then the lot number. Both as 4-digit numbers. So if your lot number is 85, you put in 0085 and it'll come up. Or you try to find a neighboring property and then you can click into the property.
Okay, next question. Do the unofficial regs have any conflicts with the official regs?
Yeah, they don't always match up. It's not common. I mean, 99% of it matches up, but I've had an issue where, so there was a change to the regulations, and that change was inserted into the, what I'll call unofficial regs, the OZ regs, prior to being inserted into where it's supposed to be official. And so, and I've seen that a couple times. So that's why I rely on the OZ regs more. But there have been instances where the OZ regs are right and the unofficial ones are wrong. And again, so you need to go to the register in that situation. But you may never have to deal with that. I mean, I've had to do that like 2 or 3 times in the last 5 years. That's all.
Okay, next question. Can you share the code reference for the less than 10% lot occupancy increase? Don't need pervious calculation.
I can by the end of the next question, maybe. How's that?
All right, next question. When existing construction is non-conforming, what amount of repair alteration pushes the construction to need to comply with current zoning regulations? For example, there are a lot of non-conforming roof decks built before 2016, and what amount of alteration pushes the non-conforming construction to BZA approval?
Okay, I'm wondering if they meant roof decks or just decks in general, because roof decks themselves are not a separate structure. And I'm going to assume so they're talking about decks or balconies. That's a good question. It's a timely question because up until about a year or two ago, the zoning administrator would allow you to rebuild a deck that was non-conforming. And I don't really think the regulations necessarily support that. We had a case 6 or 7 years ago. We were at 100% lot occupancy because of a rear deck. And the deck was removed by a previous owner for about 3 years. And we provided information that showed that the deck was there for 50 years up until that 3 years. And the zoning administrator approved it, let us rebuild it even after 3 years. Now that got appealed, and then he withdrew that approval, and then we got approval at BZA. But the change that's come down in the last year or two is that the zoning administrator seemed to determine that a lot of these decks were built illegally, and he wants proof that they were built legally before he'll let you rebuild them. Now, people are trying to repair them, and then I get the sense that this repair then becomes a rebuild, but you have to be careful. So rebuilding may not necessarily be allowed for something like that. We've got some approved. We have to show a bunch of information that it was likely legal and that it has existed for a long time, ideally since before 1958.
Okay, does DC have a green amendment, such as New York, that allows external insulation for existing building retrofit and exempt from setback encouragement?
So I always tell the architects that I know that I don't envy them, because they have to know both building code and zoning regulations. And I tell them, when I get questions like this, I can just say, I'm sorry, I don't know. I'm not an expert in building code. So sorry, no, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, could AIA or a group of architects appeal the unwritten rules you mentioned? Do you know how expensive that might be? How can you appeal something that is not an official rule?
That's a great question, Eric. And I was just thinking about that today, because I often come up against things I'd like to appeal and I wish my client would appeal, or they'd like to appeal, but it's just not worth it because of the time that it takes and the expense. So I wonder if, and sometimes we look to see, are there other groups that are interested in this topic that would financially support such an appeal? So, because you need the aggrieved party has to be the one filing the appeal. The AIA couldn't file an appeal, but they could support a homeowner or builder that's affected by an appeal. It's definitely something to look into. And a lot of times, though, a problem with the appeal also is you appeal, and then the Office of Planning hurries up and makes an emergency amendment if you win the appeal, and takes you back to where you were anyway. So case by case basis, but it's not always effective.
Okay, and we have time for one more question. Are you seeing alley lots being successfully developed under the new 2020 regs? What common obstacles might make development prohibitive?
Where do I start? So no, and I don't think they changed much at all when they changed it. There's a lot more to be done. The minimum lot area is too high. The relief to get a record lot, if you don't already have a record lot, it's impossible. You need 24-foot wide alleys all the way out to create a new record lot. which you need to develop if it's not already a record lot, which is impossible. I've never seen a property. I've never come across property that has 24-foot wide alleys all the way out. You can only do single families in the RF, even in the RF zone. Now you can do multifamily in the MU zones, of course, but in the RF zone where a lot of these properties are, you can only do a single. So I have people that have 2,500 square foot record lot. Hey, you can build a house, build a giant house on that. You can't subdivide it. So I don't, and then there's infrastructure costs, which I hear horror stories about. So I don't get the sense that the alley lots, that they really intend to encourage development. Lip service.
Okay, well, it's 1 o'clock, so unfortunately we need to end it here. Thank you everyone for attending, and we want to give a very big thank you to Martin Sullivan and Barros for bringing us this program today. Have a terrific day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.